Inside of my code base, search term is what I would call an input model. I'm using search term as a parameter during onGet, and I expect to receive that parameter from the user. And that's different than the two properties I have here, message and restaurants. I would consider these output models. They're not here to receive information, they're here for me to populate with information so that when the page renders, I can bind to those output models and display information. But now I'm in a situation where I want to use search term not only as an input model, but I also need an output model for search term so I can populate value and show the user what search term is in effect for a particular request. So one way to do that would be to add another property to my page model, a public property of type string, and let's call this search term with an uppercase S and T. And one way to populate this property would be to say that search term equals lowercase search term, the parameter, inside of my onGet method. But there's an easier way to do this. Anytime I have a property on my page model, like the search term, it can function as an output model or an input model or both. So what I want to do is use search term, the property, as both an input and an output model. And the way I can do that is to add a special attribute to this property called bind property. Bind property tells the ASP.NET Core framework when you're instantiating this class and you're getting ready to execute a method on this class to process an HTTP request, this particular property should receive information from the request. So just like ASP.NET Core went looking for something called search term when I had that parameter name on the onGet method, it is once again going to go looking for something called search term to populate this before invoking onGet. This is also model binding. And so now down here inside of my onGet method, I'll be able to say use that particular search term. Now there's just one catch. By default, ASP.NET Core is only going to bind input properties during an HTTP post operation. We're not doing a post, we're doing a get. Later in the course, we'll be doing a post. But there is a flag I can use to control that behavior. So I can say that I want to bind this property, and yes, I want that to support a GET request. So now when the user comes in and searches for something like a capital S, that request should populate the search term. I'll be using that search term to find restaurants. Now I just need to set the value of my input to that search term value, and the user will be able to see what they just searched for. There's an easy way to do that. There's a special tag helper that works with model binding in ASP.NET Core and also works with input tags and label tags, and that is the ASP-4 helper. So if you haven't noticed, all of the tag helpers that Microsoft provides out of the box start with ASP-, or at least most of them do. We've already seen ASP-page. That tag helper changes the href on an anchor tag to point to a specific page in the system. ASP-4 is a way of saying this input is for the following property that you'll find on the model. So inside of ASP-4, I write an expression that assumes I'm already working with the page model. So this can be a little bit confusing, but down here when I need to write an expression to loop through the restaurants, I have to go to my model property. That gives me my page model instance, so literally an instance of this class. But when I'm using this tag helper, ASP-4, the model part is already assumed here. So I don't have to write model dot. I'm already working against an instance of my page model, so I can just say search term. That's the property I want on my page model. What ASP-4 will do on the server with an input is not only set the name of this input so that it works with model binding and will populate search term, it will also set the value of this input to match the value in my output model property, which is search term. So you can almost think of ASP-4 doing two-way data binding. ASP-4 sets the name, so input model binding works, and one of my properties will receive this value, but also when we output, which is when we render this HTML from the server, the ASP-4 helper will set the value for output. And so now what I should see if I save all my files, and let's just re-navigate to restaurants and look at the full list. There's my 3 restaurants, and I want to search for CI, not continuous integration, but Cinnamon Club, and now I can see the input is populated. It still has the CI there, so I could change this if I wanted, perhaps making the search more specific. And I can also now cancel things out, press the Enter key, and I'm back to looking at a full collection of restaurants. So this is the magic of ASP.NET Core model binding. We're going to use a lot more model binding in this course, especially when we start to edit restaurants, because we're going to need the user to enter all the information about a restaurant, and we'll see how that works with HTTP post operations. But for now, let's turn our attention to passing information between pages. What I want to be able to do is click on a restaurant and go to more details about that restaurant, but that means some other page, some details page, will need to know what restaurant I want details about.